So Bernie Sanders is the most admired person running for president in 2020. That's according to a brand new IPSOS and USA Today poll, which asked people some pretty broad questions. And I think this kind of polling is interesting because it goes beyond the horse race numbers themselves. We get most of our polling and it's centered around who's winning this state or who's winning this group of voters or who's polling well against Trump, who's on track to win the general election, and this and that and this and that. And those numbers are very important. But they don't always tell the whole story when it comes to examining how voters feel about the field of candidates. And this Ipsos USA Today poll really steps in and fills that gap when it asks people, who do you admire in terms of character, and who do you feel represents your values? And Bernie Sanders on these questions wins in every conceivable metric. When you ask people, who do you admire most? Bernie Sanders is at 40%. Donald Trump is only at 26%, but Bernie Sanders has a nearly 10-point lead over Elizabeth Warren, the next highest ranked person, who's in the low 30s. And if you ask also about who shares your values, again, Bernie Sanders tops that list by nearly 10 points, with Warren and Trump being both at 31% and everyone else lower than that. And so you can see that when it comes to these broad questions, who do you admire? Who do you think has good character? And who do you think cares about you and by extension, people like you? Bernie Sanders is unquestionably the leader. And Bernie's not just the leader when it comes to the general electorate. Bernie Sanders is by far the strongest person in these questions when it comes to Democrats alone. And that's crucial because it really tears down one of the narratives surrounding Bernie, which is that he can't unify the Democratic Party. That Bernie Sanders may be able to win a split race where Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Biden and Bloomberg are all splitting the vote, but Bernie won't be able to bring them all together, unlike some other candidates in the race. But all of the polling we've been seeing recently really puts that in doubt. Bernie's very popular amongst Democrats. A lot of people that aren't supporting him nonetheless have him as their second choice. And as we see here, when it comes to crucial questions like shares my values, has good character, cares about me, Bernie Sanders is at the top of the list among the general electorate and Democrats. He's far and away ahead of Trump. And I know elections aren't just driven on character, and they're not just driven around the belief that a particular candidate shares your values or cares about you. But those factors do matter. And in a close race, those voters that are swayed by those calculations, you want them to fall on your side and not the other person's side. And when you run someone like Warren versus Donald Trump or somebody else versus Donald Trump from the Democrats, what you're going to see is that they're actually rather quite close to Trump on these questions, meaning that whether or not we would like to believe it, most Americans don't really see Warren or Biden or Buttigieg as having much better character than Trump or sharing their values much more than Trump does. It's only Bernie that would give the Democrats a really distinct advantage on these key questions that matter to a lot of voters. And I think really explain why Bernie Sanders is so special, because he does politics in such a different way that it's undeniable that he's running on character. It's undeniable that he shares the values of regular working and middle-class people, the hundreds of millions of Americans that work so hard to build a better life for themselves and their children, yet fall behind due to systematic issues of inequality, social and political and economic inequality. They get Bernie Sanders. And some of this maybe even is driven by the fact that because Bernie is so consistent, you may not always agree with him, but my goodness, do you respect him? I really do believe a lot of this is driven primarily by the fact that Bernie Sanders is speaking to voters in a way Donald Trump and the mainline Democratic candidates just aren't willing or able to do. One final thing from this poll, which was actually quite interesting, was they asked suburban women who they felt represented them when it came to these questions. And that's a very important question because suburban women in the last 2 elections have played a major role. White suburban women were very crucial in Donald Trump winning in 2016. White women still gave Donald Trump a majority of their support, even if it was much smaller than what white men gave. And that was absolutely crucial in Trump winning those very, very close states that gave him the Electoral College victory. And in 2018, one of the things that really helped Democrats was suburban women, educated women in crucial districts, flipping from Republican back to Democrat and helping them win dozens and dozens of seats in the House of Representatives. Those women back Bernie on this question. They think Bernie has the most admirable character, and they think Bernie, at the end of the day, is the person that shares their values and cares about them. Not anybody else, not Elizabeth Warren, not Amy Klobuchar, not any of the neoliberals, not Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders. And this again tears down another narrative, because one of the narratives in 2018 was, yes, these women drove the Democrats' success in the House, but it was a moderate victory. It was moderate Democrats that replaced Republicans throughout the country in 2018 off the backs of suburban women, suburban white women voting not for the Republicans, but for the Democrats. But this shows that they're open to Bernie Sanders, that he represents their values, that he's seen as caring about them, that he's seen as having a good character. And I think that will matter to these women. And it also tears down the Bernie bro narrative, because that narrative has existed since 2015, and it's been all predicated on the fact that Bernie Sanders will always struggle with women, he'll always struggle with anybody who isn't a college-aged white bro, and that Bernie Sanders, therefore, doesn't represent the diversity of the electorate or of the Democratic Party. But here we see quite clearly that suburban women see in Bernie Sanders the type of politician they admire and relate to more than anybody else. So these numbers are often hard to translate directly into top-line horse race polling. It's not necessarily the case that these numbers could be directly connected to any particular rise and fall in a candidate's polling at the national or regional or state level. But I think that when you see numbers like this, it really does show that Bernie Sanders represents a different style of politics for Americans inside and outside the Democratic Party. And that key voting demographics that often decide elections, like suburban women, see a lot to like in Bernie Sanders. And even though many of those women might not be willing to vote for Bernie Sanders right now, the fact that he has those key character and relatability markers means that they will be more open to him than they are to most people in 2020.